Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Maria Papaiouannou. I'm the arts manager of the British Council in Greece. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today on sustainable and circular materials. The event is being organized in the context of our wider sustainability program, Circular Cultures, and is part of EUNIC, European Cultures Week. For those of you who don't know what EUNIC is the network of the European National Institutes for Culture. And this year, the European Cultures Week is dedicated to sustainability. And it aims to raise awareness of the impact of human activity on the environment and share good practices. Our 1-hour masterclass with Nick Gant will explore circular systems and sustainability, but will also present the flip side of circular design, the cultural aspects of material language, and the values and benefits and the spin-out benefits from circular economies. Sustainability and circularity are key priorities for the British Council. We have started our program 4 years ago with a focus on sustainable fashion and design, moved naturally to crafts and circularity, and this year, as part of our Circular Cultures program that we co-organize in partnership with the Onassis Culture, we will focus on materials. Our aim is to embed a more critical dialogue around design and circularity, develop skills and knowledge of making leaders, and create new European and British networks around sustainability and circularity. All those years, on our side, we have had major UK and EU institutions doing a unique and pioneering work in the sustainability field, such as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Fashion Revolution, the University of the Arts, Central St. Martin's, University of Brighton, the European Fashion Heritage Association, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and we hope that our network will keep expanding and evolving. I would like to thank Nick Gant, founder of the Community 21 Design Agency and principal lecturer in design at Brighton University, for his enthusiasm and willingness to work with us again on this program. And of course, our two panelists on the second part of the event, the research and design studio, The New Row, and Fotini Setaki, and Matthew Edwards, founder of the experimental design studio Mate, and Parvinder Marwaha, of course, our colleague from the design department, the architecture and design department in London. Before we kick off, please allow me to remind you some basic house rules. Please remain on mute and keep your video off during the session. Please keep your questions in the chat box stating your name and organization. This webinar will be recorded and shared through our comms channel at a later date. And in case you face any technical issues with the chat box, you can send your questions to my colleague Katerina Galani at katerina.galani@britishcouncil.gr. Without further ado, I would like to give the virtual floor to Nick. Nick, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Maria. First of all, yeah, brilliant to be here. It's a real honour, as always, to work with you guys, and my sincere thanks to yourself and to Katerina for your help in inviting me here today to talk to everybody. And it's great to be here. I'm at home with a mask. I don't have to wear a mask at home, but I'm here, so it feels very unusual still to be talking to people from across Europe whilst being at home amongst the washing and the the ubiquitous bookcase that we wheel in just to make it look like we've read lots of books, but they're mostly cookery and gardening books. So but yeah, so do forgive me if anybody interrupts here. My family are here with us as well. So but ordinarily I like to use lots of materials and physical things as part of my presentations, but of course that isn't possible at the moment. So I am going to do a presentation which I hope will be of interest to you. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully this will work seamlessly. And I'm sure Maria will tell me if we can't see it. Is that okay? Can you see okay?
Yeah. Yes, we can see that.
All right, so yeah, my name is Nick Gant, and as Maria said, I work at the University of Brighton, which is an organisation that's been working with sustainability for a long time. And Community 21 does lots of projects with lots of different organisations across the world, as well as locally and regionally in the UK where we are. We've been working in these areas for about 20 years now, on and off, a little bit more than that actually, in various guises. And the kind of organizations that we've partnered with and helped them to develop their sustainability agendas or their social agendas are these kind of organizations. Many of them are global institutions, but we do a lot of work with local charities and local NGO partners who do projects at a local level or through distributed networks, which I'll talk a bit about later on, as well as these larger global organizations. So here's a picture of me doing a talk, and the reason why, because I'm here doing a talk for you as well, but one of the reasons I brought this slide up is because it's about a project we did a few years ago, back in 2012, for the Puma organization, the sportswear brand. And we created a 50 ways of thinking and doing sustainable design. And I suppose as a way to start this presentation, it really helps by saying, you know, there's no single one answer to these problems that we're facing or these opportunities that we're generating. And there are 50 ways here that could expand and breed 50 other new ways. And really, I hope that today that we can explore something that's quite pointed, something that's quite focused as an idea that's gained a lot of gravity in the sustainability sphere around circular economies. But it's also to invite the notion that what we need is a plurality, I can never say that word correctly, plural ideas about how we engage with the social and sustainable problems that we're faced and generate new opportunities. So what I'm presenting you today is by no means a sense that these are the answers, but they certainly should give you an indication of the kind of work that we've done over the years that helps to express and engage with some of the kind of practical problems, but also some of the meta ideas that we're trying to explore about how design can help in the world. All right, my talk is called Virtuous-Circular-Economies, the social, cultural and material value of thinking in the round. And it's going to take four kind of parts. So there are effectively four kind of chapters, if you like. Thinking in the round, which will open up the ideas about sustainable thinking in terms of circular economy, exploring this notion of the two sides of the circle that we'll talk about, thinking about stories and narratives, that are very important to underpinning the kind of technical and scientific aspects of working with materials in this way. And then we're going to finish up with a fourth chapter that's really about thinking about the more expansive social and cultural opportunities that emerge out of working with materials in this way. And of course, we'll be able to provide questions. And as Maria said, hopefully you can feed into the chat and Maria will collect up questions that we'll ask at about in about 50 minutes from now, towards the end of the presentation. All right, so part one, where to start? With the circle. I mean, this is a really simple idea in many respects that has great complexity built within it. So when we think about thinking in the round, you know, circles are the theme for today, really. And the concept of circles and cycles inspired around ideas to do with, you know, growth, use, consumption, but also replenishment and rejuvenation and the kind of systems that might be found in nature and the natural environment around us. And we're relating these very much to ideas around production and consumption of matter, of stuff, of physical things. Matter matters, okay? It could be argued that, you know, our main ambitions around sustainability are related to matter or matters of matter, of physical stuff, whether it's the production of gases or pollution or waste that's created in our consumption cycles, the impact of mining and production, energy, and the depletion of natural systems. Matter really is at the center of this. Stuff really matters. As creatives, as a designer like myself, our ideas really only become problematic as soon as we start making things. As soon as we turn our ideas into reality, then stuff tends to get consumed. Stuff tends to get dug up from around the world and used to make the things that we want to create. And it's argued that anything up to 80% of the impact of the things that we create as designers is defined at the design stage. So for creatives around the world, it's really, really important to be thinking about our relationship to matter. All right, so I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with these concepts, but really just to underpin what we're talking about today, the linear economy is very much this notion that we dig big holes in the ground. Tom Thwaites will tell you that almost everything comes from a hole in the ground at some point, and we dig up materials, raw materials from the earth, and we turn those into alloys to refined material products. Whilst we're doing that, we utilize energy, we create pollution, gases, and so on. And whilst producing those material products, we then move them, transport them across the world to create the actual products and artifacts and objects that we then sell into our consumerist systems. The problem is that once we've done that, we dispose of them very, very quickly. And this linear process, in many respects, is utterly inefficient and far too short. And really, circular thinking looks to really engage with that in a very different way. So it's not a new concept. The notion of circular economy could be related back to Walter Stahl, who was a designer and economist back in the 1970s. And lots of different authors, scholars, and designers have looked at this idea of what we might call closing the loop, regenerative systems, or circular systems like cradle to cradle ideas and things like that, such as those that you'll find created by Michael Braungart and William McDonough in their book Cradle to Cradle. So really the circular system looks to break this notion of the very straightforward line and to rejuvenate. So this is drawn from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who have been fantastic kind of champions of the notion of the circular economy as an idea. And I've redrawn this image from them. So when we think about the circular economy, it has three perhaps key characteristics. So we want to design out waste and pollution. We want to keep materials and products in use. That's either through reuse or repair, remaking or recycling. And then we want to ensure that where we can, we regenerate natural systems. And for many of us, we think about all of the stuff that we have available to us, the alloys, the plastics that we've generated, we should be using and reusing those continually and leaving natural systems to get on and do their thing. So really, we have enough materials in the world to work with, and we want to rejuvenate and replenish and reuse those in a continuous circular system. So I'm going to talk about that in more complex terms as we move through. But today I wanted to do this through examples that we've generated ourselves as an organization. So starting points here, really, this was, I use this because it's, I suppose one of the early ways that we started to think about this as a system process. So the airwave table here was generated in 1996 and was the first piece of furniture that I created. Now, when we look at it as an object, it's very, very simple. And there's circular thinking built into this. As an industrial designer, I was working with a materials company, a polymers company that produced this material, and we were looking at how to make objects that would promote the simple use of it. It's a singular recycled material, so it's all made from one type of material, all made from one single sheet. And it uses a fluid form that's laser cut out, that's very, very efficient to produce, and it's a tessellating shape, so there's very little waste. Not only this, then we construct the object using no glues or no screws, so it's very, very easy to disassemble. So really, it's a very simple way of starting to describe and express. It's an informative object, if you like, that talks a little bit about what you can do within a circular system and how you design these ideas in. So my technical command allowed me to think about taking a single material like this, that's 100% recyclable, and put that back through the system. Now, what was very interesting for us at the time was the material manufacturer that was producing this material actually had a take-back system with its manufacturers around Europe. So whenever they had any waste material, they could freely give them back to the organization, and the organization would recycle them. And this is really interesting because at the time, this was a really good example of a circular economy. But the organization itself wasn't that keen to promote this because it didn't want to be seen to be using second-hand stuff. And this is back obviously over 20 years ago. And their brand was very associated with quality and purity. And they didn't really want to promote the fact that they already had a circular system in place. And of course, lots of organizations are considering circular economies very much from efficiency reasons. And in this organization, obviously, this is an oil-based material as a raw monomer or polymer, and therefore the hike in prices around the world of oil makes a very disruptive system for them and a very disruptive base from which to build their products. So to be able to use circular systems allows them to own and control these materials on an ongoing basis. Here's another example of a seating and lighting product we generated in 2002. Likewise, it has one very simple LED lighting component, which was quite contemporary technology back then that we worked with Philips on. And there's two-part structure, which is very, very strong, is blown using a material in a very efficient way and allows us to separate it and put the materials back through the cycle again. Likewise, this table uses very efficient LED technology and allows us to take the two materials, aluminium for the frame and the acrylic polymer for the lighting component in the center, and one very small lighting unit that very efficiently distributes light across the material, and we can separate it off. So to scale up again, similarly to the airwave table, this bright space dome that we created is made entirely from one material with no aluminium or metal structure holding it up. It simply uses a cold formed plastic sheet that's made from 100% recycled material and can be recycled itself again. It's very, very lightweight. Obviously, it uses the geodesic structure that many of you will be familiar with from Buckminster Fuller, but it does it in a way that really thinks about the circularity of the product in the fact that because there aren't these multiple materials ingrained into it, or there are no kind of hybrid or composite materials within it, the material can simply be chopped up, chunked up, and made into another product again when at the end of its life. So a single recyclable material, cold form, which uses very low energy to produce. It has no glues in its construction, and so it's very easy to disassemble, and it's very, very lightweight and uses very, very small amounts of material. So this 3.2 meter building is exceptionally strong, but is only made from 0.75 millimeter material. So again, going up in scale here, this is a project that I worked on and was led by one of my colleagues, Duncan Baker-Brown. And this is the first house that meets full building regulations in Europe that's made entirely from materials that other building sites have thrown away. So the building industry is seen to contribute something along the lines of 60% of all waste and energy production going into the manufacture around the building industry, again, makes it one of the biggest polluters and biggest consumers of energy. So we were looking at a process of taking building materials that have come from other sites to produce a whole house that meets building regulations this way. And so within the simple idea of simply using old materials, there are lots of different evolving practices that can happen. So we took carpet tiles that were dispensed from an industrial warehouse. We took materials that were taken out of the ground to make space for concrete foundations to build a house, and used that chalk to create the central structures in this building itself. So there are lots and lots of different ways that we can consider circular design within the notion of thinking in the round. So just to sum up there, what we've shown is a number of different examples where we are really thinking about reuse, recycling of materials. And that's quite a technical process that requires us to really understand what are the capabilities of the materials that are around us and that exist already. Many of them have been manufactured, and we can remanufacture them very, very simply and put them back through the systems. But that requires design thinking in the round. We need to remine existing resources and make more efficient use of finite materials so that we can prevent waste and prevent pollution and leave the natural systems to thrive themselves. Okay, so I'm going to move on to part 2 now, and this starts to shift the thinking away from some of the more technical aspects of utilizing materials and designing material scientific or technical process systems that allow us to put materials back through circular systems. So on the one hand, we have this very objective notion of being able to quantify the amounts of materials we engage with and take a very economic and kind of scientific approach to the recycling and reuse of materials. And we need to really shift our thinking as well to the more cultural, subjective and qualitative ways of thinking about the circular economy. And in this chapter, I'm going to explain what I mean by this. So in many respects, when we think about these two sides of the circle, we need to think about engaging around this notion of the behavior of matter. So really understanding the materials around us and what we can do with them, but also matters of behavior. And this is really important. We believe that circular economic thinking and outputs really need to appeal to the heart and not just to the head. In many respects, when we think about the things that we waste in society, they often come from the way that we think and the way that we feel. not just the things that we do. What we do is we consume things and we throw them away. But why? Why do we throw away televisions and toasters and mobile phones that are still fully working? The majority of electronic goods that we dispense of actually still function when we throw them away, and that seems really inefficient. Our head may tell us that our washing machine or the car that we drive is inefficient or outdated technology. So that's something in our mind that's triggering us to turn that object into waste or to get rid of it. Our heart might tell us that the jumper we wear and the clothes that we wear made up, kind of project our status or our interests or connect us to this year's fashions. We just don't love it anymore. So really we need to think these things through, because a lot of the waste that we generate is actually because of the way that we think and the way that we feel. So it's important to compose that alongside the technical aspects. All right, I'm going to use shoes as an example here. I use shoes a lot. We make lots of shoes. We work with shoe companies, and shoes are a really interesting product in many ways because they help to personify and embody this idea of the two sides of the circle. They're a kind of good object really to explore the human-centric nature of it, as well as the kind of material aspects of it. So here we have two kind of quite different pairs of shoes, and I'm sure many of you will think about the shoes that you wear whilst we're talking about this and I'd ask you to kind of question really the shoes that you buy. Do you buy them purely because of their performance function, i.e. with the head, simply because they perform a very specific task for you, which might be based on science? Do you buy your shoes through, reading scientific journals or paper about the performance of the materials? Or really are you buying them because of what they represent and how they connect you to your tribe or to your culture, or even represent the ideals that you present in the world? So really, if this starts to kind of prod at this idea of how do we think about objects and products and materials in the cultural systems that we live in. If we were to take these two pairs of shoes, to be honest, I could probably do a whole lecture on just this one image, but you'll be glad to know I'm not going to do that. But if you look at the shoe on the left-hand side here, a very traditional brogue shoe made of leather. Some people will say, well, this is a sustainable shoe because I'll hold on to it for a long time. It may have some sentimental value to me. I can probably get them repaired, and that's a really good thing. But other people will say, well, yeah, but they come from the leather industry, and the leather industry creates a lot of pollution, a lot of carbon dioxide, and so therefore that might be considered problematic. So really that, housed within that pair of shoes is a whole debate about circular economy and rethinking the way that we kind of engage with our objects. On the right here, the croc, the plastic shoe, many people will say, wow, this is made from a polymer material, which is really problematic. But also you can argue that actually it's a very, very efficient shoe to make. It's injection molded. Actually, it comes with very little packaging. And if dealt with appropriately, and that's really important, if it's managed well within a circular system, it could go back, be chomped up and made into new shoes. So actually there's a whole kind of set of evolving stories here that are about the technicalities of the material, but also about the cultural interpretation of how we think about these materials and how they behave in our worlds. And actually, as materialists in the world, we often really start to polarize discussions around what is good and what is bad in society. And actually, when we go to the supermarket these days, we're often expected to kind of take on board all of these ideas about what materials are we consuming and how do we think about them. But it's complicated, right? And the thing is, our cultural interpretations of things like carbon would probably say something to you like this about polluting environments. Carbon is seen as almost the devil incarnate. But that's a real simplification, because carbon obviously is one of the most prolific materials in the universe. And in many respects, when you combine carbon with DNA, you create things like us, the building blocks for life, DNA. We are made up of carbon. And when we die, we compose, and that carbon goes back to the soil. Carbon is one of the things that we think about as not only as dirty, but perhaps one of the most treasured things in the world. So again, I'm trying to press upon you here, how we think about these materials is often how they're valued. And those value systems are very, very important to consider in relation to how we use and consume stuff. If you take gold, for example, gold is a fantastic example of a material we never, ever throw away. Why don't we? Because it's valuable. But why is it valuable? It's valuable because it has technical properties, but I would ask how many of you think about what its technical properties really are and how it's used in the world. Actually, I would argue that its function in the world is to express ourselves, is to express ideas about our values, our relationships, and our connections between people. And that's very, very intangible. Here's a really good example of an object that I think helps to kind of personify our changing thoughts and cultures around materials. So this is a syringe, a very, very important product in the world to help vaccination and the prevention of disease. But this is a historic example of a syringe that's made from ivory, which of course comes from elephants, and is a material that we would see as almost abhorrent in many cultures around the world now. But of course, that doesn't mean to say that it isn't an important object. And this, in many respects, is another example of one of those. So the plastic bottle, once the container that would hold this water of vitality that we get from fresh springs around the world, and helps us to have live our healthy lives consuming this material, is actually housed in a material that now has been personified again as one of the key polluters around the world, and our oceans are, of course, littered with this material, which is really, really problematic. So there are different narratives and stories that are emerging, which is what I'm going to talk about a bit more in my next chapter. But it's really important that we start to consider that if a material like this exists in the world, we need to understand how we behave around this material, as well as what the material can do itself. So as I say, we must embrace the two sides of this circular economy. So on the one side, we really need to get to grips with the economic value of the materials that we have around us, to manage them efficiently, and to create scientific, objective methods of quantifying that value and creating new uses from those materials. But equally, what use are technically brilliant, efficient, and scientifically groundbreaking processes and products if no one wants them, if no one understands them, and no one desires them? So we must equally understand our different cultural appreciations of different materials and products, and think about how we engage with the subjectivity of design and creativity, and think about these broader notions of what values might be, not just the economic ones. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in the next part. Okay, on to part 3. I'm just going to have a quick slug of water. So please feel free to generate any questions, feed them into the chat, and hopefully we'll get a good chance to, we're on time, so hopefully we'll get a good chance to have some discussion at the end if there are any things that you want to bring up. Of course, some of these ideas may be things that you absolutely disagree with, and of course it's really good for us to have a debate about this, but I hope some of this will be making sense. All right, so we're moving into another kind of area here. So this related back to some of what I've been saying before around this notion of stories. Now this may seem really kind of woolly, a little bit intangible, but we believe that by combining these two elements, the technical and the subjective, the cultural together, is really important in developing new products. And I'm going to show some examples of that here. Okay, so here are oh, sorry, somebody might need to mute. Okay, thank you. All right, so here is our plastic bottle. Okay, one of them has been recycled 6 times. The other one is made from virgin materials. And I think this kind of exemplifies the problem here. As a consumer, how do we know this? In actual fact, polymers are really good at being recyclable and being put back through the circular systems. And they exist in the world already, so we need to use them, and we need to use them appropriately. So thinking about how we do that is really critical. So I'm going to show some examples of hopefully products that build in stories and narratives that really use visual material, visual language, material language as a way to communicate some of these ideas to consumers, and explore how as designers we might design in some of this value to what would otherwise be wasteful stuff. So here are another pair of shoes. This is a pair of shoes we've recently produced. And the point of these is to really explore this notion of the communication of the circular economy. So if we take the previous example, the bottles here, we cannot tell whether they've been recycled or not, and they may well have been recycled lots and lots of times. So in this set of shoes here, you can see that the small green Wellington boot on the right hand side here, the material from that has been chopped up when they weren't used anymore and used into the pink and green one. So we put a number 1 there so that you can see how these materials get reused. And the system moves on like that. So the material moves into the second iteration there, the pink and green boot. And then when that's fulfilled its use, that can get chopped up and put back into the third boot and so on. So this is really just starting to explore how we educate our students and some of the organisations we work with to think about how they could start to communicate the use of PVC, which is a relatively easy material to recycle. It's quite problematic, very problematic to produce in terms of its environmental implications. So it's very important we think about how we communicate the value of this material being used time and time again. I'm going to use a local example here. So here's a rather grainy, image postcard of my hometown in the UK here, Brighton. And this is the bank holiday weekend. And COVID didn't actually have a big impact on this. You may have seen on the news that beaches around Europe were still full of people despite the pandemic. And one of the key issues with this is this. Okay, so despite our cultural appreciation of the impact of the waste that we produce, it still seems to be that, in certain sectors, in certain situations, we still generate a lot of waste. And we have these awful situations where huge amounts of waste is generated by the populations coming to visit our coastal towns. So back in 2010, my partner Tanya Dean there, you can see with our young daughter there, we're working with the marine conservation societies and the beach cleanup campaigns. And of course, these are things that people have become very familiar with now. But we were really looking at, as designers, how do we engage with the community that cares about the beach here and utilize that energy when starting to think about products. Now, it was really interesting for us that as soon as we started to go around the beaches and collect up these materials and reorganize them, we started the process of creating our circular economy. And what was really important is we could gather these materials, and many of them were actually very similar in their makeup. Most of these materials here that you're looking at are 1 or 2 types of polymer material, which are actually quite easy to recycle. And the second that we take them out of that polluted state from the natural environment, they start to take on a different persona. They almost look like perhaps Far Eastern threads or something like that, but they have really exotic colors that we can repurpose and reuse. Now, we also explored the notion of actually getting the people who generate the material by going and harvesting it, recovering it from the beach. And we set up a t-shirt press that we could press pairs of flip-flops from this plastic material. And like I say, this is going back about a decade ago. And what we also did would actually take a heat plate that we could press a map of the place where these materials come from onto the bottom of the shoe. So you can see what we're trying to do here is to build up a whole range of different value systems around the material that explore both the technicality that you can take this material back out of the marine environment where it's a really considerable hazard, and you can turn it into new stuff. But not only that, by getting people to help you make that stuff, or for people even to make the new products themselves, they start to invest in the materials in different ways, generate new value systems around these materials, understand them better, and really hopefully elevate the value of what would otherwise be waste into something that has real meaning, could almost become like a memento or souvenir of that event, and it embodies the kind of care and energy that people are putting in to really recycle and reuse these materials appropriately. So again, you're balancing the technical and the cultural and the social. So here, Adidas have obviously, with their Parley for the Oceans, Parley are a fantastic organisation that really looked again at the kind of technical aspects of how do we take this really big international problem of marine pollution. And I've talked at a number of different events alongside marine scientists and organisations that are dealing with the tourist economy, and it's a big problem, not just for the marine environment, but for the health and well-being and the financial health of lots and lots of communities around the world who are suffering as a consequence of our inefficient and bad use of these plastic materials. But what I'm looking at here, obviously, is a system that creates a pair of trainers, a training shoe, out of what would otherwise be marine waste. And you can see that the way that Adidas here have presented this information, and again, it's quite technical, and it's showing how the material is rejuvenated. But equally, what's important about this is the story, the narrative, almost the mythology of these organizations going out into the world. Interface Carpets, who I'm sure many of you will know, have done a fantastic job of exploring what the social and cultural value is of getting fishermen in the Maldives or in Indonesia and the Philippines taking this marine plastic waste out of the sea and generating new opportunities for us to make new stuff from it. So like I say, both these things have utilized both sides of the story. And this is a product we launched for New Balance. We ran an event at the London Design Festival in 2012 called Local Design Activism. And we were really exploring this idea of thinking about how materials might have meaning and value to us locally. So New Balance, who obviously an international company, took one of their quintessential designs of shoe and made it from waste materials or locally grown materials from the neighborhood. And it's a really interesting kind of play on that idea of, in the UK and in Europe, obviously we have these notions of farmers markets, of local markets where produce is produced within a certain area or a certain regionality. And of course, big manufacturers around the world are starting to explore this notion as well. And I understand that Adidas and Yeezy have been exploring local production of their training shoes in the USA as we speak, with Kanye West really driving this notion of the importance of that. So these are two of my students. I'm going to show you work from some time ago now, again, that I think really exemplify this idea of the narratives and the story. So these are kind of perpetual poetic products that have a purpose. So in this case, this is a coffee cup, but it's made from cold formed coffee granules. And again, there have been other examples of these kind of products emerging around the world, and that's fantastic. There are a real diversity of different types of thing. But what I think is really beautiful about this is that it's a very pure product. It's made from 100% cold press, just using high pressure to create this object, which is fully compostable or can go back through the system and be reused and recycled again. But it has a wonderful poetry to it. It helps you, it's an informative object. It helps to tell you a bit about its principles and its priorities, and would hopefully move you as a customer, as a consumer, to know that the materials that you are wasting in your day-to-day, having something as simple as a cup of tea or a coffee, could go back into the system like this. And this was generated by one of my students, Adam Fairweather. And he now runs Smile Plastics in the UK that do lots and lots of plastics recycling. And they do now work with 3 countries across the world that produce coffee to make products from coffee, including whole coffee machines. And then this, I'm sorry, this slide for some reason is very, very grainy, but another really poetic example here is Anna Bullis's gumdrop. So this is a chewing gum bin. It looks quite big on here, but actually it's about the size of a bowling ball or a bit smaller. And actually you put your chewing gum in it. So a material that's actually a kind of polymer material, although it sounds like it's kind of natural gum, it's not. It's actually a very synthetic material that of course creates litter and is a pollutant in our urban cities in particular across the world, and causes local authorities lots of cost and so on to produce it. But also it's a material that, you know, in our research centres, we really think, well, how can we better use this? And what does it mean to use it? So she created the gumdrop bin, which you can put your gum into, and actually the bin itself is made from chewing gum. So she really understood what were the polymer materials that go into chewing gum, but not only that, but really thinking about how the object itself tells a bit of a story and a narrative about what it is. So it looks obviously like a piece of blown gum. You put your chewing gum in it and the whole thing can just be chomped up again and turned into more bins. But not only bins, but other gum related products. So like a gum sole on a trainer. These trainers are also made from chewing gum. So whilst on the one hand, like I say, you're dealing with a technical problem of the material, you've also got this incredible narrative and story emerging that gives the objects around us new meaning and new values, based on the fact that when we recycle the material, we don't just recycle its physical state, we recycle its history and its language. And that really gives objects a new kind of authenticity that perhaps other virgin materials lack. We've been exploring this, like I say, for quite some time. Here's a set of products that we created as part of a research lab back in 2007, where we brought material scientists and social scientists together to think through how objects could be. And obviously this is an old-fashioned, in many respects, mobile phone, but the idea was that you could chomp up your clothing or objects from your day-to-day consumption and have it made into the chassis of your mobile phone. And this was really thinking about whether you could generate what my colleague at the time, Jonathan Chapman, refers to emotional durability. So again, exploring this notion of how do we develop attachments to objects? Well, one way might be that those objects even look like us because they are actually combined, produced from materials that combine the materials that we have around us, that represent us, that, you know, are very much a part of our persona, embodied into the otherwise homogeneous objects or very simplified objects that we would find on about us on our day-to-day basis. And something like this, like a camera, is a really good example of an object or a product in the world that's suffered massively from new iterations, new technologies as they emerge over time. So your 1 megapixel camera a year from the day that you bought it is already outmoded by a 2 megapixel camera, and so on. So what we really started to explore there was this notion of how your objects could start to become technically proficient at dealing with this issue. So you could buy component parts that could go back through the recycling system, and when you need when memory gets outmoded because it gets much bigger or has greater capacity, you can simply replace the section that you need to. When lenses become more technically proficient, likewise, you can take the lens feature off and clamp it together. Now, obviously, we're using a kind of old-fashioned clamp here to make the kind of visual point, but nonetheless, it's really important to start thinking about how these things interlock and configure to allow us to make circular systems out of these really important alloys and materials that go into our technology products if we're going to insist on renewing them so quickly. So like I say, what you end up with is a sort of composition of different technical parts, which can go in and out of different smaller or larger circular systems. But equally, what you do is you start to generate a narrative object, an object that tells you a bit about its life, its history, and it almost becomes like a little library, a little collection of parts that hopefully would develop some sustainable narrative with you and would hopefully increase its product longevity. All right, so in chapter 3, then, we're really thinking about that when we reuse or we recycle a product or a material, we also recycle its meaning and its history and its value. Many of these materials have been on journeys, have been places, have interrelated to us, we've had interactions with them, and by recasting them into new stories and new narratives, we can broadcast these narratives in ways that hopefully will design in this kind of idea of new authentic desires. So for more sustainable materials and more sustainable products, we need more stories and more narratives to emerge. And our speakers that are joining us later on today absolutely have those in abundance. So I'm looking forward to seeing some more of those. Okay, so we're just about coming to the end here. So in my last chapter, I really want to kind of draw attention to this notion of the expanding notion of the circular economy thinking. So the use of the word is really, really significant. Culture is about people, is about human beings and our behaviors. And we've already explored that, you know, we are creatures that respond to things in very diverse and different ways. And it's really important as part of circular economies for us to understand this. Moreover, what we're noticing is that when we're developing circular economy systems, there are different benefits that are emerging out of that. So this is where we come with this idea of the virtuous circular economy, to try and explore some of these added values that are not just monetary. So the definition in the Oxford Dictionary in the UK here of a virtuous circle is a recurring cycle of events, the result of each, one being to increase the beneficial effect of the next. And this is really important. So the case study we're going to use here, as we've done with our other products, is a research project called the Wiki Waste Workshop that we've undertaken with the British Council and with the Utopia Foundation, and was led by ourselves at the University of Brighton and the Dreamcatcher Foundation. And really this starts to explore the opportunities that exist within circular economies to really expand the values and opportunities that can be generated by simply taking some stuff that's a waste over here and turning it into something that's useful over there. So really we explored the development of this model where we would take the notion of a place, could be any place, could be a village, it could be a town, it could be a city. And we would explore the notions of the needs and values that exist within that place and what waste resources and materials that they have there. And then the Wiki Waste workshop is really, it could be a physical space, in many cases it is, but also it's a virtual thinking space where we really think about how do we generate stuff, generate products that replenishes and rejuvenates the needs and the values of this place in positive ways. And then equally, how do we share those ideas, those ideals, the things we learn with the rest of the world? So here's, again, a rather grainy image, sorry, that I borrowed from the New York Times here, but this is a picture taken in South Africa where Matthew is talking to us from today, and a place where we've done nearly 5 years worth of work now, working with communities, township communities, that have issues around waste, where waste has been dumped in certain neighborhoods, is burnt in certain neighborhoods, and this is really, really problematic. So you would have a poor township community where waste from wealthier communities is pushed out to their neighborhoods, and this has a really negative effect for a whole range of reasons. Not just in the fact that who wants to live in a dirty environment where there are dangerous materials lying around. It has an impact on obviously the pollution and the air quality in those areas, particularly when it's being burned. But also this has a really negative impact on people's self-esteem, on their identity and their well-being. Who wants to live in a place where rubbish is burnt on their doorstep? It's in many respects a form of kind of social repression. So the Dreamcatcher Foundation knew of our work, and with a colleague at the University of Brighton who've been doing lots of work in social development considering waste, we developed the idea of the Wiki Waste workshop. And really this was looking at international kind of interest in how we could develop small circular economies in small communities that are distributed across the world. And this would really reference projects like Waste for Life, Professor Caroline Bailey, and then more recently work such as the precious plastics configuration of communities across the world, which Dave Hackins helped to curate and invent, that really thinks about what we might call the distributed manufacturing economy. So thinking where materials stay local and stay circular, so materials that are on your doorstep that you use in the circular systems, but that are parts of kind of intranets of ideas. This is what Ezio Manzini refers to as sort of cosmopolitan localism. So the idea that we have local networks like knots in a net where products and systems and services can be locally efficient, productive and meaningful, but they connect to the rest of the world. And open sourcing is one of the ways of thinking about that, of course. So open sourcing the knowledge to allow us to share ideas about the circular economy. So we worked remotely with one community in particular for 4 years now, developing ideas about how we could take the materials that exist in their neighborhoods and with our students and with our researchers working together to produce different products. So in this case, a very idiosyncratic wood that is an invasive species of Acacia cyclops that has taken over a lot of the natural species in that area, and also a lot of plastics that exist from food packaging and so on, and turning them into new products. And this affords us great opportunities. We take the material out of the neighborhood that's a pollutant and that's being burnt there, and we start to kind of really understand what the opportunities are to work with it. And this changes people's identities and relationship to the place in which they live. It's allowed for social cohesion to exist between different age groups to start to explore, okay, what use can we make of this? This is an environment where education doesn't really cover entrepreneurship. There's no design or creative education going on in the schools here. So by generating the notion of a wiki workshop, we simply share between our students and the students there, the young people there, and some of the older women in that community, and really explore how we can take these materials and use them positively. And the British Council have helped us develop this work over the last couple of years with DICE funding. So here's an example of a product that uses plastic bottles that are abundant and the local species of cyclops. Now, this is actually made from ash by one of my colleagues locally to here, a material that's unfortunately, because of ash dieback and a transfer of different diseases, we've now got an abundance of this material to use, but it helps us to explore how that material could be used in South Africa as well. And by doing this, and by working together collaboratively like this, we share information between the different communities about how we generate value. So simple carrier bags, when they're composed with nets that carry onions or fruit, can create a much stronger material. And this we learned by experimenting together remotely in communities across the world. We think about the value that different brands have when they're recomposed into a new object. We think about the poetics and the serendipity that happens when we work in different ways. And we've learned a huge amount by working with different communities and understanding how their skill set and how their engagement with materials can tell us more about what we can do with it. So this is a fantastic example of where a young person is re-engaged with the local natural systems and natural heritage of their area and really thought through how could they start to create objects that they could sell that would help to kind of build opportunities into what they're doing and create these really beautiful plates and souvenir objects that talk about the local history and the cultural history of their area, but using something very, very simple as carrier bags. And it's creating new opportunities for people not to pick through waste sites or landfill sites in a really negative way that feels very negative in terms of their identity, and gives great opportunity now for new systems to develop where the local authority don't have them, new recycling systems that help people to contribute to the cleaning up of their neighbourhoods, but also the establishment of new knowledge and new opportunities. I'm really thinking about how this could transform the identity of that place. We've been very lucky with British Council funding. We've been able to support 40 new organisations in and around this community to grow into new businesses that really apply lots of these spin out, what we call the kind of spin out benefits and opportunities of working in the round, working with circular economies. And we've been very fortunate that through our connections and networks and through the technology that we have available through the internet and so on, we're able to share with different countries around the world, just as we are now through our computer systems. The materials quite often are very, very similar. Of course, there are indigenous woods and natural materials in different neighborhoods in different countries, but a lot of the plastics and a lot of the synthetic materials that we need to reuse and recycle in part of our natural system, in part of our circular systems, are things that all of us would find around us in many, many countries around the world. So we want to use those effectively. Okay, so really what we're looking at here, as I say, is we have this circular culture. We've got this opportunity to develop businesses and opportunities. And it's really important that we consider that as part of this circular system, we're really thinking about designing out waste and pollution, keeping materials through reuse and repair, and regenerating natural systems as part of the kind of pillars of the circular economy. But equally, we're adding these kind of what we define as the kind of spin out values. So there are great opportunities to really consider education, entrepreneurship, new opportunities. Think about how you generate new cultures of community cohesion between different age groups, provide new opportunities, and really think about health and well-being as a fantastic opportunity that can come out of a negative starting point of our wasteful consumer cultures. So that's pretty much it for me. That's my talk in my 4 sections. I hope that's been of useful to you. We've used very much our own work, of course, and of course there are millions of examples around the world, and there's a fantastic culture of different cultures exploring these ideas and ideologies, which obviously we welcome being part of. And thanks to the British Council and to EUNIC to allowing us to participate in this debate. I think I would just put one more slide up just to finish, and it's this really. And I suppose this is one of the ways that we think about approaching our projects, and when talking to certainly our masters in sustainable design students and undergrad students, thinking about where as individuals we might have agency. And this is a way of thinking about scoping, and this is relevant to circular economies too. So obviously, you know, I can have an impact on what I do as an individual, thinking about what I can do at a local level with the things I consume. And I'm very lucky that I can make things and the things that I can make. Equally, we believe that it's really important that people work at a community level, and many authors and scholars in this area will concur with these ideas that actually all of us can contribute to a community conversation, whatever that community is. It might be online, it might be locally, it might be in our neighborhood, but most of us have potency and power and opportunities for change at that level. And in many respects, once you go beyond the notions of our community, however we see or feel that, actually that potency and power often drops away very, very quickly. And that's why we have things like distributed manufacturing, multi-local societies, so communities of communities, like the networks that the British Council and others are helping to perpetuate. So where you can have meaningful exchanges at a local level that then can connect to the rest of the world, so that you really do develop a kind of an ecology. And then let us not forget that, of course, there are big organizations in the world that can make significant change. And if you're working for one of these at an operator level, then of course, we hope that you can work with these kind of circular systems as well, because I've worked with a number of organizations now where a small amount of change can have a big, big impact. All right, so I'm going to leave it there. And again, once again, thank you very much for listening. And hopefully Maria will help me field some questions now, if that's okay.
Nick, thank you very much. That was really inspiring, I think, for all of us. What I would definitely keep, is what you mentioned about the connection of waste to our value system and to society, and you shared with us so many brilliant examples. We have a question. We have 3 questions. Actually, the first one is connection to the collection system of materials. Katerina Halani is asking, are enough materials collected to guarantee reliable feed for the needs of production? And how do we move from prototyping to production?
Okay, thank you very much. Do we collect enough? Well, I think it's fair to say when we look at these pictures, like I say, of the negative impacts of us not managing our material systems well, then I think it's fair to say, no, we don't collect enough. But I think there is diversity. And again, going back to almost to the last slide I showed, the circular economy is different in different places. Some of the biggest companies in the world have been doing circular economy thinking for a long, long time, because it makes absolutely, perfect sense. The very first slide I showed you of this table, why would you rely on systems that are disrupted by war or by conflict, when you can actually own the material yourself and put it back through circular systems? So there are organizations that are spirited and motivated, perhaps by economic means, simply by optimization and efficiency, that do a very, very good job of managing these systems. And really, we need to support and understand and champion that notion of the efficiency. Of course, it does bring into question the politics of who owns all the stuff, who owns all the materials. And through the British Council, Pavinder and Hannah's work there, looking at the cultures of circular economies across the African continent, one thing we noticed very early on in the lockdown was material flows are obviously interrupted. And this is a problematic situation. But I hope that what I articulated a bit through the last example I showed you in the community in South Africa, which of course is happening in different ways all across the world, is trying to spin the bottle, the plastic bottle, if you think, in a way, away from this notion of the negativity around waste and discarding of dirty stuff, and really trying to retune our thinking about how everything has a purpose. We have this analogy in our team that there's no such thing as waste. It's just stuff in the wrong place. And I think there's some real truth to that. And we really need to identify where these cycles of stuff are, where waste occurs, and how we can adopt that and bring that into our systems. And how we move from prototyping. I presume what's perhaps meant by that is by these kind of objects that perhaps I've shown you some of, which are speculative. Well, yeah, I mean, I think we're in many respects still in relatively early stages of thinking about the perfect circular products. And we, in many respects, as designers, this is how we think, this is how we move, this is how we learn, is to create things, physical things. And that can seem contrary to the idea of waste and consumption, is to experiment in this way. But I disagree. I think it's really, really important. And many of our students often question, why are we even making stuff? You know, we shouldn't be making anything at all. But I don't think that's true. We need, if you want to change something, you really, really need to understand it. And prototyping is the way of building understanding in a way that you can move on. And many examples of the products that I've shown you that are in prototype form have their iterations or diverse examples of them that are now in mass production. And of course, that's where we need to move to, is a mass of ideas, a mass of bespoke ideas, or a mass of mass-produced ideas. It doesn't really matter as long as the principles are ingrained there. I hope that goes some way to answer the question.
Thanks, Nick. That's great. There is another question from Delia from the Norwegian Institute at Athens. Delia is saying that she's particularly interested in textile reusing, both textiles coming from factories no longer active and clothes. Where can she get more information and input on the subject?
Well, obviously the British Council itself is related to a number of different organisations. One in particular is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is based in the UK but works internationally. They have a huge amount of resources about how to engage with textile waste. Equally, a colleague of mine who works in the Institute of Circular Economy at UCL in London, they do a lot of work around circular economy, circular thinking, in particular in the fashion industry. And likewise, the Burberry Materials Foundation is also doing a lot of work in this area. So there are 2 or 3 there that I would steer you towards. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation is a great intermediary organisation. It's not particularly biased in any particular way and has great feelers out to big companies and organisations across the world, and has lots of resources in this area. So I would really recommend you go and have a look at them.
And our last question comes from Christina Muraiti, and I think it's a very relevant question to all the sustainability events that we have organized so far. How is it possible to persuade an individual to buy a recycled product? For example, Gibbs, those gum shoes cost roughly about $250. Pretty much everybody nowadays understands the importance of environmental protection. However, that doesn't mean they can afford it.
No.
So any comments on this, and how do you see this changing in the years ahead?
Well, I think this is one of the key areas that comes up routinely. So it's a really good question. I think, but it isn't. I think it's fair to say that the relationship between the idea of recycling being more expensive isn't, in often cases, it's not the case. It doesn't automatically mean that something recycled, it becomes more expensive. I mean, when you take Anna's shoes, for example, she's a small manufacturer making objects on a low scale. Now, of course, if you go to equal examples of people producing work at that scale, you would expect shoes to cost around that money. Now, whether you or I could afford those, in a way, is a different thing. But working within that field and at the volume she's working at, I think she would argue that her objects are very competitive price-wise. But this goes back to, again, the slide at the end I was talking about in terms of the scale of operation. Of course, what's equally important is that our big producers in the world get circular, and lots of them have made big commitments to do this. Now, whether they're for reasons of altruism or charity to the rest of the world, who knows? Or whether they're to do with more of this idea that actually it's very important for us to hold on to our stuff, either because we're going to be legislated against, or it's simply not going to exist and we won't be able to make stuff because other companies and other countries that are in competition with us own the materials. Who knows? There's a lot of debate around that area. But it is, of course, down to those bigger organizations to allow to make this stuff affordable as well. And, you know, big companies like Henny's and the companies that they're associated with have made solid commitments to become fully circular within the next few years. And that's really, really critical, because, of course, it's important that we do understand the value of these things at all layers. But as I go back, hopefully through my presentation, I think what's really critical as well is helping consumers to make that choice. So by having objects that have signatory opportunities in them, have a visual language, building our kind of opportunities as consumers to learn about material language, to understand it and be able to translate it very, very easily, but equally as designers to help to express the principles that are built into our products so that consumers can kind of make that choice at all levels, right through, whether it be a piece of packaging around your sandwich that you buy at lunchtime or something as big as a house.
There is another question. Our biggest challenge to using recycled plastic is consumer perception. And she's asking whether you have any good advice in communicating the importance of this to mainstream consumers. So I think this is another interesting topic to touch upon.
Yeah, it really, really is. And again, you know, it strikes right at the very heart of where my interests lie, really, in having come from working as an industrial designer with petrochemical industries. You know, in many respects, people would perhaps quite rightly point and say, well, you know, you are the problem. But of course, you know, and in many respects, it might appear glib and, you know, irresponsible to point to certain things, but it, you know, it is very difficult to distribute water without plastics in a safe way. It's very difficult to inoculate people without plastics, single-use plastics. Single-use plastics, you know, are a very important part of how we address some of our carbon responsibilities. The problem is we don't manage the material well enough. And I'm not pretending it's an easy thing to manage. In some respects, within the laboratory or within the manufacturing facility, you can manage it. But it takes real care, and it takes a kind of commitment across the whole of a network to make sure that the material is cared for well. In terms of perception, I go back to, I guess, some of what I was trying to cover in my talk, which is that, yes, we need to build the kind of profile of plastics as not just being the Beelzebub, not just being the bad boy in the materials library. We need to recognize that we have this stuff, it exists in the world, and we need to look after it, manage it, and see it as precious, as Dave Hackins and his organization do, and really build that kind of notion of a new narrative around plastics that really is about caring for it as a material. I noticed, I think Seetal has joined us.
Seetal has joined us, Parvinder has joined us. So I think we are ready now to go to our panel discussion and to welcome our two guest speakers. Matthew Edwards from MATE. Matthew is based in Johannesburg, South Africa, with a focus on designing with materials and processes in the South African context. He approaches design through the concept of recycle, redesign, reduce yourself, and make do. And we have the new row, the duo from Rotterdam. The new row is a research and design studio based in Rotterdam, founded in 2015 by the architects Panos Akas and Fotini Setaki. Fotini is with us. So thank you very much for joining us, and I think we are ready to kick off the discussion. Nick.
Hi there. Yeah, I mean, it's great to have both of you here and everybody. And of course, we've got colleagues, many of you who you will know in the discussion as well. So hopefully we can keep a lively discussion going on the chat. Matthew, I believe you've got a short presentation that will introduce yourself, and Maria's obviously done a great job in helping to give a scope of your work, but we'll give you an opportunity, perhaps 5 minutes, if that's okay for you, to just give us an overview of the kind of things you do.
Sure. Thank you, Nick, and thanks so much to the British Council for making this happen. I'm thrilled to be a part of it. So I'm an industrial designer, and my work sort of occupies a multidisciplinary space. A lot of it has to do with testing things out, and I came across this concept of make do, which is sort of, when I rationalized it later on down the line, it seemed like it was aligning with these concepts of ad hocism and the idea of the bricoleur. So these are ways of working in my space that involve me using hypercontextual materials and processes and tools that are very accessible to me in my studio space, and sort of reprojecting materials into those processes. So how can I recycle plastic using what I've got in my workshop? How can I do work on shoes? So how can I repair shoes or or edit shoes or customize shoes at a high level using methods and processes that are sort of contextual to my space without needing ridiculous equipment. So it's very low tech. So a lot of my work is about reframing material value. So South Africa has a huge plastics recycling informal economy. We have people called reclaimers, and it's about 60,000 plus reclaimers working in the South African recycling economy, and they divert up to 80% of plastic waste, which saves South African municipalities about 37 million euros in landfill space per year. So plastic is a really interesting material to look at in a South African context. So I essentially just started to see how I could use my space to create an object of significant value. So I created this signet ring, which is a sort of really interesting look at how a plastic material or material that has a particular value can be sort of elevated in status and then sort of shared with people. And I use a system of taking machinery and processes to sort of hack a press together, which allows me to sort of punch out these rings and do some finishing on them to get a material of value. So on the right there, you can see the sort of make-do approach to processing plastic in this space. So yeah, I was sort of confused at how I can start working with plastic. So I just started like a bricoleur, just putting parts of components together to see how I could start processing these materials. This is another project I worked on, which is essentially using the South African footwear repairers who are, it's a phenomenon where most suburbs have a footwear repairer that works on the side of the road and that will repair shoes all day. So I wanted to learn instances of their techniques that I could then apply to footwear design and or customization or editing. So using a very simple tool, I'm able to start editing footwear, repairing it, and then keeping materials in a sort of the loop process. So instead of buying a 2,000 euro sewing machine, I'd rather learn a much lower tech process and develop that within my design practice. Sorry, just going forward again. This is a project which was sort of also looking at the future of footwear and how materials can be valued in certain ways. So I used a moss to create a shoe that would sort of talk to the material possibilities of footwear in the future, but it was sort of a performative project in what footwear could be, what it is now, and it caused quite a stir in certain people's minds because they weren't too sure how to feel about it, and that was really interesting. And I'm just jumping through quite a lot of things at the moment, but I just want everyone to get a sense of the work that I do. So this is just reframing materials and just having a look at the processes in producing certain things, from Oregon pine to terracotta. And I'll end off with this project, which is a shoe customization project that I did, where I created a double layer finish on a shoe that over the use of the shoe's life, the gold scratches would sort of come through. So the shoe would show its gold elements off over time as the shoe is worn. So celebrating the wear and tear of the shoe and communicating that sort of longevity of life. So
that's brilliant. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, pleasure.
I jotted down a whole bunch of bits of terminology that you used there, which I think, going back to some of what we've been discussing this morning, is really exciting. This notion of hyper-contextualized materials, and I really like this sense of you kind of remixing and you know, looking at this sort of notion. You use the term editing, which I think is really, really interesting, and this sense of a sort of building sense around sort of subcultural uses of materials, which I think is really fascinating when we have our great big you know, singular objects like our mobile phones that all look pretty similar and, you know, don't have a lot of character, into objects that you're exploring that really start to build on that notion of the diversity, if you almost like the sort of archipelago of different ideas that can happen from different locations that speak to broader concerns. So thank you very, very much for that. Fatini, are you here with us? Similarly, if it's okay with you, we'd really like it if you could share your screen and give us a short introduction to the kind of work that you do as well. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Fatini Sitaki, and together with Panos Akas, we are co-founders of The New Raw, a design studio based in Rotterdam. And what we do through our work is to explore the possibilities between design, circular thinking, and digital craftsmanship. We started in 2015 from the observation that we are a growing society consuming enormous amounts of resources and generating a lot of waste. So this was one of the images that kind of moved us to start working in this direction of showing as designers what we can do to actually eliminate the problem of plastic waste. Because what we realized was that actually plastic waste is a design problem. It's a material that is designed to last for very long, but we use it very often in single-use applications. So we try to develop a workflow where actually we give value to this discarded material, not only by using new technologies, but also by trying to shorten the material life, the material processing flow, but also enabling participants, citizens, to participate in this workflow. This video shows a bit our approach from waste to product. So basically, the first step is to sort plastics and make sure that they are clean and monostreamed, and then shred them, make them flake size of 3 to 5 millimeter, and then feed the printer and start melting them in order to give a new shape, a new life to this previously discarded material. Very often, people ask us, okay, and why do you use 3D printing in order to recycle plastics? For us, this has many different answers. Of course, a technical approach would be that by using 3D printing, it is possible to create forms that are customized, like this bench that we designed especially for Mechelen, that its shape was formed inspired by the architecture of the neighborhood. Or, for example, that 3D printing supports concepts like design to recycle, as we did for the province of South Holland, where actually they wanted a bench that is from one material together with its foundation. So when this bench is not needed anymore, the full piece can be shredded and used in a new project. Also, by using 3D printing, it is possible to integrate different functionalities and, for example, make pieces that combine a table with a sitting area, etc., etc. But what we think as designers is that by using new technologies like 3D printing, we can actually empower citizens to be part of the not only of the recycling process, but also in the decision making. This is a concept we explored in Thessaloniki 2 years ago, and there we opened an experience center in the city center of the city where we could run educational programs and inform young students and professionals about the bad aspects of using plastics, but also the good ones, and make them part of the recycling process by giving them the opportunity to bring their own plastics and recycle it for this project. Besides this physical location, we had also a digital one, a website where citizens could log in and customize the new street furniture of the city. And in that way, express what they are missing from their cities. Within 3 weeks, we gathered about 3,000 unique designs that we later translated into printable designs, like the ones you see on this slide. And what we wanted to show here that actually, by using new technologies and participatory design, we can think of new shapes and new forms that can enter the public space. Each bench can be now unique, but can also combine different functionalities like, for example, a planter, a dog feeder, or a bike truck. But what we are particularly proud of this project is that we managed to close the loop of plastic waste literally locally within a diameter of 15 kilometers. So the material was discarded, recycled, and then repurposed within the same region. And in that way, avoid really complicated logistics that very often happen with recycled plastics. Another project that we think shows very well the potentials of using 3D printing in the recycling plastics is the Second Nature project that actually started as a small R&D exercise where we collaborated with divers and fishermen trying to understand whether lost and abandoned fish nets can become the raw material for 3D printing products. Our first result was a series of limited edition tableware that we produced with small-scale printings, but gradually our knowledge on this material grew. So we were able to actually make a bigger effort out of it and have, let's say, be able to create, let's say, a full series of furniture for the hospitality industry, all made by shipping and fishing gear. This series of furniture is processed in Piraeus under the auspices of the Blue Cycle project. So just to close this short presentation, I wanted to say that I really believe as designers, we can add value to discarded materials and, let's say, suggest new ways of using this material in a meaningful approach. So in long-lasting, easy-to-trace applications, but also involve the user into the process and making them be part of the decision-making, let's say. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Fatini. Yeah, both your work, both of yours work are obviously very, very inspiring. And I was particularly struck, Fatini, by this notion of, again, of your integration between technology and the community, and that this idea of having kind of 3,000 designers contributing to a process, I think is really, really interesting. And of course, 3D printing has been one of those things that's been sort of framed as a potential silver bullet, you know, solving all of the world's problems. And I think many of us working in this field have been a bit skeptical about that. But I think what your work does is really, really demonstrate something that's utterly fit for purpose and really explores how you can utilize that technology. And you use the word meaningful ways. And I think that meaning making that you deploy through your work, I think is really, really exciting. So I think I'm allowed to ask some questions. Yeah, so I mean, this morning we were talking about this kind of duality, these two sides of the conversation. I think both your introductory presentations, in my mind, really helped to kind of articulate some of that. So on the one hand, you are obviously becoming masters of your technologies, of your materials, and I don't know, it seems to me that you're inspired by the materials and processes that are presented to you, and you look for ways to adapt, hack. You use the word hacking and transferring those into something. But it seems as well what you're doing is you are moving into that notion of the subjective field of looking at narrative and storytelling and the ways that you communicate these technologies in ways that make them really, really interchangeable with the histories of things that don't speak to us very well, into new worlds of really thinking about how we interact. And Fatini, you talked about the creation of your interface where people from the public can come and through your design methodology then interact with a robot to get something that's meaningful out of the other end, which is, again, it really throws back, you know, in our face these ideas of automation and mechanistic processes being something to be really concerned about and present some more positive view. So I was going to ask if both of you could give me a sense of whether you feel that you really impress upon or engage with your design process of thinking about those two sides. They may not be so polarized, but you deploy both the technical and the subjective and the cultural in your thinking. Matthew, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting space to work in, and particularly for me, I think the material defined a lot of the process at the start of it. So understand, obviously throughout the process of designing an object, we understand or we research how to process it, and we gain this knowledge through examples of what's happening in the world. But there's having access to those technologies, or that there's having access to the information, but then there's having access to the technology and those levels of production. So I think I felt like I was in a space that oftentimes there was the information, but the access to the technology or the process was missing. So there was this blank space that I needed to fill it within my own capabilities. It's an incredibly sort of difficult space to work in because there's so many unknowns. And but I think there was what happened throughout that process of creating systems or processes to design with certain materials like the plastic was that I, number one, learned far more about the material. I have to do much more research into the potential hazards around manufacturing with what I'm using. And then I obviously have to make it work with what I've got. So I think there's a really interesting duality between the New Raws stuff and what I do, in the sense that there's super high tech and then super low tech. And so it just sort of shows the interesting, the different ways that we can approach materials. And yeah, this need to actually just start working with them within our current spaces, and the sort of innovations that come out of that are really interesting to me.
But I mean, I would read into your work again what seems really interesting again within our, I feel like, our ecology, our cultures of circularity, is that you're deliberately, though, deploying, if I'm not misinterpreting, this sort of notion again of subculture. So your football boot that's designed for a specific sensibility or a specific place, or so recasting and recoding a generic material like plastic into something that has local relevance and meaning in the world is part of this notion of transition, I think, into cultures where we can understand what's presented to us, because designers like yourself are helping us to translate and understand the materials that are in front of us. It seems like a very deliberate act as you're sort of engaging people through your products. Does that seem reasonable?
Absolutely. I also think a big emphasis in that cultural projection has to be on the process and the tool too. So I think like communicating the object's sort of contextual relevance is one thing, and we can do that through storytelling or bringing people into the process. But another way is to show people that it's been made using ways that are sort of contextually relevant. I think that was something that I uncovered through that process, particularly with the football boot, was projecting a current sort of status quo of making that wouldn't have normally been used particularly for that way, and adapting it to suit a sort of a mass manufactured element, or bringing part of a manufacturing system or process into the life cycle of an object that wouldn't normally have been there. So a cobbler repairing football boots is sort of seen as an afterthought. Whereas if we bring that into the early stages of the design process, how can we change the sort of the narrative around that material or that object's circularity?
Absolutely. Fatini, how do you feel about this? Do you feel that you are deliberately a sort of a storyteller, a narrative, somebody who has to invite the world in to engage with what you do, as well as obviously being a technologist?
Yes, definitely. I agree with you that the storytelling is a very important part of what we do. Because also a bit connected to a question that was raised before, that, for example, sometimes by just recycling materials, you might have an excuse to consume more. But what we try to do through our work actually tell a story about sustainability, and actually raise awareness about the problem as well. And in that way, let's say, change the behavior of the consumer towards a more sustainable and circular thinking. Also, by, let's say, being designers, I think we are able to think of the same problem that is global in many different localities. And what we have noticed in many of our projects is that actually plastic waste is a very local issue and a cultural issue. And I think to being able to adapt to certain, let's say, special occasions that there are in every place that we work, it's something that designers really can address through flexibility and out-of-the-box thinking, for example.
Absolutely. And again, I think both of you really exemplify this notion of trying to generate this sort of, and again, forgive me if it's the wrong way to describe it, but this sort of Darwinian nature of, you know, we need this diversity, we need these plural ideas, and for these things to have local relevance and local meaning to really excel in like we say, communicating the values and principles that underpin thinking around a very generic material. So thank you for that. So again, this morning we were talking a bit about what we, you know, frame as these sort of spin out benefits. And again, I feel like I can see it in both of your work. But Fatini, to start with you, how do you feel about this notion of the sort of expanding circle and the fact that what you start to do is encompass or envelope new opportunities and you know, new values and new benefits that you perhaps didn't design into the system in the first place, but you can perhaps, you know, design into future products. So you're seeing these things kind of emerge out of your experience of prototyping. Is that something you were familiar with, or?
Yeah, I mean, actually, when we talk about plastic recycling, it's usually a topic that is discussed in bulk amounts. And there is this recent movement of smaller, let's say, workshops that are processing plastic in much smaller amounts. And actually, we are able for the first time, let's say, in history to craft this material, because even if you look historically, this material, it started being processed in industrial scale. So being involved in projects that we work with amounts that are like 200 kilos, 1 ton, you're able to understand much better the properties of the material, but also bring in values that have not been explored before. For example, some of the projects shown that the plastic is not plastic fantastic, but has some textures coming from the recycling story of it, or the different colors that come from the previous life of the material. So it's certain properties that we haven't seen before, and I think actually can contribute to a different way of thinking regarding recycled materials. Because something else we have noticed is that very often people think that because something is recycled or from recycled materials, it should be like of no value, like you could get it, let's say, for free, but they don't realize that all this material processing, collection, the new application needs a lot of time and a lot of labor-intensive work that actually we need to, as consumers, start thinking differently about sustainable products and prefer them because they are sustainable and not because they are cheaper, for example.
And again, I think that's what's so intelligent about the way that you're working, is that you're helping, you know, you're educating through your processes, and you're highlighting this need, these sets of principles that are quite complicated underneath what you're saying, but making those translatable and experienced in really tangible ways, which I think is fantastic. And again, as a spin out, if you like, benefit is this real opportunity to educate the public, and for that to be a kind of loop, you know, and a learning system in itself, which is certainly what we've experienced. How about you then, Matthew? I mean, what are you seeing as the kind of additional benefits that might happen at a community level or a cultural or social level that are happening as a result of what you're doing with, you know, effectively, you know, at a material level?
Sure. I mean, yeah, it's really interesting because I'm sort of taking these processes that are available and contextual. I think there is definitely space for pilots to move out into community spaces to either increase production or for people to make their own things with regards to this. I keep going back to the football boot, but the idea of repair is such a sort of common theme in the global South and particularly in South Africa due to necessity. So there's this language of repair that we can sort of tap into both on a material level, on a production level, and then even on a sort of aesthetic level too. So one of the main spin-offs that I have is a visual spin-off, which is, you know, the the beauty that we're sort of finding in materiality that's being worked, reworked, reimagined, recontextualized. So I think a big part of me is trying to deal with that narrative of what materials and projects or products start to look like further down the line throughout recycled processes, and try to help people engage with that visual aesthetic.
Absolutely. So again, I feel like you guys, with your technical expertise, and as you say, the real rigor that you both have to put into learning how to develop and manipulate these materials so proficiently and to master them as processes is something to behold. But equally through that process, you're learning how to make the processes themselves more accessible. And Matthew, you talked about access a lot, and that certainly strikes me as being a more and more important thing in this day and age, and in our ever-changing, daily changing situation, is that notions of access seem really, really critical to this. So, I mean, we're coming to the end of the session here, but I did want to kind of reflect on that a little bit more than just, where we are today. And then, here we are in different countries, and we're all experiencing slightly different things around this big topic that we haven't really mentioned, dare I even mention it. But I wonder if recent events have, had you reflecting about your design purpose, what you offer in terms of your circular consideration, and whether that does impact on the way that you're thinking about the future, and whether you've got anything you can offer us in terms of hope and positivity. But also, how are the implications of the pandemic really impacting on the way that you're thinking about your design products and processes? Again, Fatina, do you want to start?
First of all, to share just some personal thoughts, like for me, the pandemic kind of showed how important plastic is in our lives, and actually in certain, let's say, urgent situations, the importance of being able to offer solutions that are from plastic. On the other hand, it also, all this situation highlights how many things we consume or how many times that we travel. It was not so necessary. So it invites us, this situation, to rethink how we behave, how we consume, how we live. So I try to be on the optimistic side, and let's keep the good things that come out of it. From our side, as the new role, what we now try to think is how to adjust, let's say, our company to the current situation. For example, also working in distance, etc., but also in what kind of services are we going to provide. So our first reaction, since we work a lot in public space, is to self-initiate a project that we are currently running about how public space experience might change because of this corona situation or similar difficult situations, but at the same time keep behind the agenda the environmental aspects of what we do. So let's say, because sometimes during this period, it was very often that you think, okay, when you think of the pandemic, the environment is not in the agenda anymore. But what actually we should always think is that we should take for granted that the environment is always in the discussion. So that's what we work on at the moment. On a project that we try to reflect how the experience in public space might change, how, for example, the future, the furniture of the future will be of a pandemic-proof city, but also at the same time, it's a sustainable way of producing them, sourcing them, etc.
Thank you. Pandemic-proof products. That's a new triptych for me. That's really great. Thank you. Matthew, what can you help us with in terms of our future thinking around these issues, and what kind of observations have you made?
Sure. I mean, it's been really interesting to watch and to be a part of the South African community during a pandemic. I think the first thing worth noting is our privilege and our access to things, and that was definitely something that I took stock of, and the ability to keep working in my studio during that time. But I think the two things that I took out of it, one being sort of the resilience of South Africans, both in a sort of economic space, because the economy is crumbling, but our resilience on a material space too. And it's this idea of shifting and being agile and creating new opportunities and selling this thing and making this thing. And you've just been retrenched, but now we're going to be making like vases, or, you know, so there's a definite resilience that comes with that. And that was really interesting to me. But the other thing was the speed of manufacture. Everything just seemed to slow down. So I mean, a lot of my work is produced by hand, so it was really interesting to take those long hours out of a day, and sort of the rapid prototyping is out of the studio space, and we're back to slower, more traditional means of manufacture, which was a really interesting thing to start playing around with again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Matthew. And I note that Maxwell and Sital and Pavinder from the British Council are here now, and we've been working on this program across the African continent. And we were very struck very early on about, like you say, Matthew, this notion of the different ways that people can experience access to stuff, to materials, and how for some people supply chains diminish to nothing almost overnight, and for other people it really did forge a notion of really being resilient around what is available to them on their doorstep. So it's a very complex time. Well, look, we're coming to the end of our session now, and I wanted to thank you both very much for your inspiring work, and it's really helped me to think through some of my thoughts and unpack some of these processes around circular thinking. And I hope for the people who've participated today, they have learned something, but also that we've shared something about how, you know, at the center, the circle has a kind of notion of care about it, and that hopefully we can use this opportunity that we're in at the moment to really think about how we care for each other a bit more. So thank you both, and thanks again to Pavinder and Maria and Katerina at the British Council for your support in helping us bring this discussion together today. And I'll hand back to you, Maria, if that's okay.
Of course. Thank you very much from our side here in Athens. Thank you very much for being with us. You, Nick, Fotini, Matthew, I wish you all the best on your future ventures. To our audiences, I would like to thank you for being with us. Please stay tuned for more announcements around the Circular Cultures program that I mentioned at the beginning of our event today. Register to our arts newsletter, and let's be in touch for the next ones. Stay safe and keep creating.
Thank you. See you, everybody.